that God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts so that we can say, Abba, Father. Reading is from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he ceased, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. And he said to them, when you pray, say, Abba, holy be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us. And lead us not into temptation. St. John Baptist de Lasalle, dear Jesus in our hearts. Amen. I'm a little prejudiced, perhaps, to the version of Luke's version of the Our Father, which we just prayed. I always get annoyed at the introduction of the liturgy that let us use the words that Jesus taught us, because the words in Matthew, which we use ordinarily, are perhaps there's a lot of interpolations in those. Most scripture scholars say that this version of the Lord's Prayer translates almost perfectly into the Aramaic that Jesus would have used. And so the Lucan version in chapter 11 is much closer to what Jesus probably told them. And of course the big difference is whether you think about Our Father who art in heaven, you tend to think of heaven as far away and up, or whether you are able to call God by the familiar title of Abba. All right. There's Gus. Good. Gus said some nice things about me last night, so I suppose I should reciprocate. First of all, deny that I'm the scholar that he thinks I am. I think my genius, if I have any, is a popularizer and making other people's scholarship more available on a wider basis in an entertaining and frivolous way. The problem about, and I have to say too, that certainly in doing this thing together, we have enriched one another very much, and I certainly have been as much enriched by Gus's very meticulous and careful and detailed documented preparation as I have by anything I've ever been able to do on my own. And as a matter of fact, when I'm doing this in one of the accordion versions, either short, usually shorter, I have the slightest hesitancy in stealing some of Gus's best stuff, which of course I guess is the best compliment you could pay to anybody. He's much more careful about text and things than I tend to be. As far as the disagreement between us on the founder leaving the Institute, well, maybe I ought to be, he'll have the last word tonight. But I suppose you all have to make up your own mind on this thing. I think the way I would state my view is this. Now, speaking strictly of the period between February 1712, when the founder left Paris after just before the judgment in the Clermont affair, and down to the moment when he received the command to obey, or at least to the moment when he got back to Paris, or decided to accept the order, my feeling is that he was trying to make up his mind. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that he was seriously thinking of letting the Institute go its own way and leave it to a combination of God's providence and the brothers' ability to carry it on, and that if God wanted the thing to survive, it would. And I think he seriously thought that he might drop the whole thing or get out of the way completely in Santa Bom. I think he was tempted to think that way in Mond. I think you have to read the blank carefully whether he was living with, I don't think he was living with the Capuchins. At least Blanc talks about the lodging which Mademoiselle Saint Denis de Lescure provided for him. But anyway, however that is, I think it took Timothy. He was thinking of settling there, or attempted to anyway. It took Timothy to get him back to Grenoble. And even in Grenoble, I think he certainly was living in the community, there's no question about that. But at Parmeny, he seemed willing to settle there, and of course that the evidence for that is not in Blanc at all, but in the biographies of Louis. So I think through all of that, he was trying to decide. And but I think he was keeping his options open. And he certainly was interested in the Institute, I don't deny that at all. And he may have been able to keep better contact with the brothers in Provence, although I think a lot of that probably occurred between the time he got the command to return and the time he actually went back, waiting perhaps for Sheikh Tardy to die. So at any rate, I think that this was a period where he was trying to discern what God's will was in his regard. And I think he was really prepared to go in either direction. So to that extent, I've modified the view that I once held, that he was really ready to pack it in altogether. And so whether it's a question of leave the Institute, I don't like to phrase it in those terms. I think the best way to phrase it, well, Miguel Campos says that the brothers abandoned him, he didn't abandon them. But I wouldn't think of it so much as leaving the Institute, period, but as leaving the Institute to its own devices, leaving the Institute in the hands of God and leaving the Institute in the hands of the brothers, that he had done enough. I think that even explains the writings, that that's a contribution he could make without actually personally being involved. So anyway, you have two views and you have to make up your own minds of that. And it's not even clear how completely we disagree. Okay. Now, of course, Gus went over most of this last night rather thoroughly, so I don't suppose I have anything left to do this morning. At any rate, what do you want to talk about this morning on these topics? These are the things that are covered in the readings from Blanc. The return to Paris, that very again, first of all, his reluctance to take over the government, although he obeyed them to come back. Part of that command was to take over immediately the governance of the society, which he seemed reluctant to do. And that whole business with De Brue, fiddling around about responding to his questions and so on and so forth, I think perhaps he didn't want to get reopen that whole question all over again and go all once more through the whole business he had been through with Sheikh Tardy. And of course the question was the title of superior. Who was going to be the superior? And so in a sense he was the superior. There was the ecclesiastical superior. There's the pastor of the parish, who was the only protection that the schools had. And I think he had to cover his flanks there. And of course the archbishop. So all those personages were involved. So it was a kind of a complicated thing to fall into the trap of saying, this one is the superior, for example, himself, or Bartholomew, or somebody, and then say, well, no, you've got an ecclesiastical superior. Remember old Pierrot, you want to go through that again. So that probably explains it. Anybody want any insight on that? Gabe?
No, I have a problem with this. He spent such a long time in this section on recreation.
Well, let's get to that after.
Okay.
I just wanted to move back just a minute or so. Let us say De La Salle did leave the brothers. According to you, what would have been the major loss? Are we able to single out maybe if he sort of went up to Parmeny and Spain or whatever, what the major loss to us might have been if he severed connections?
If he severed connections at that time, I think it's pretty clear that the Sulpicians would have taken over the brothers in Paris. The other brothers in other places would have been subjected to the ecclesiastical superiors that they had, and the institute would have dried up. We'd all be Sulpicians. We'd all be Sulpicians today. All right. Do you all enjoy the story of the exorcism?
Oh, yeah.
Losing all your toenail. Better be careful. That's what happens to those Lutherans when they get converted. Whoa. Kind of a funny story. Exorcisms have had a great vogue lately, of course, in movies and things, so we could dwell on that a lot. I have a few theories on all that stuff, but we better not get involved with John. Okay, eventually, De Brue, who apparently has been toned down considerably by the Cardinal now that De La Salle is back on the scene, lets him go to St. Jan, where he takes charge of the novices. I don't think he was doing an awful lot of extensive writing during this period. The principal work that came from his pen during this time probably was the collection and of short treatises and the explanation of the method of mental prayer, which basically emerged out of the conferences he was giving the novices in these various periods when he had them. He had them for a period, then he went to Paris, and he had them again for a short period when he came back. And this seems to be the period when people think that he put that this work on the mental prayer comes into being. And also, perhaps it was at this time that he began to write out some of the meditations, which would be connected with that. Is that true, Gus? That's more or less. That this is the period when the meditations come from?
Well,
the writing of them?
For sure is that the meditations for the time of retreat used a New Testament that was published in 1707. That was established by Michel Salm.
Yeah.
So you got to figure out when did he have time from 1707 until he died. It's probably towards the very end of his life. As part of Michel Salm's thesis, that those meditations represent the vision, the clear vision he had of the whole thing. That's why the meditations are so crystal.
What about the Sundays and feasts, those other ones? It seems to be, I heard somewhere or other that some authors felt that these were put together in this period after his return from the South.
And it's true what you said about being related to his talks and analysis. It's almost like the Sunday meditation where the talks he gave to the analysis about the gospel on Sunday.
Especially obedience, I suppose, and that sequel Epiphany. Okay. He said, Bartholomew asked him to go. Now, he's still the superior, but Bartholomew is more or less running affairs, so he asked him to go to Calais and Boulogne, but then old Blanc has to remind you that he already told you that story back in the other volume when he was talking about the foundations up in the Channel City. Okay, the last handout you're going to get from me.
76.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's my fault. Frank tells us that there are 76 handouts. Suppose every time you say 76, you can say that's the spirit. Even before Gus read this to you last night, I had duplicated it. This is a page out of this book, which I've been keeping from you. This is a bit of collusion between Joe Joswiak and myself. We had to decide what we were going to do with this, and as I think I told you in the beginning, I said, oh my God, if we give it to them or give it to them in the beginning, they'll never read Blanc. It's a shortcut. But so we thought that it would be an excellent idea to suggest to you that you read it at the end of this Buttimer one as a review. So, and that you would be given an opportunity to buy it. So that's why we passed out, that's why we passed out those order blanks. But actually, I was asked by Joe Schmidt to put this together when I was working on something else, and he said, "Can you do it in the next 2 years?" I said, "Well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it in the next 2 months." But it was relatively easy to put together because I had all these notes I had done Buttimer 1 about 3 times when I was asked to put this together. So this is, if you read through it, most of it should sound rather familiar. Anyway, I thought it would be nice for you in this context to have this page with this very important document that Gus spent some time on last night. One of the things I'd like to point out to it is that in French, this is all one sentence.
Wow.
And it's obviously very legal style. It's my feeling that, of course, the lawyers drew it up. That, as almost always happens, you leave it to the lawyers to put the thing together to get all the loose ends pinned down and nailed down and so on. And since I was just doing this one page, there's a lot of, we have the quotation from the founder, and Canon Blaine's signature on the thing as the ecclesiastical superior, and then Bartholomew's trip. Now, since we have just yesterday looked at those things in the South, if you go up to the second page there, so his first stop is in Chartres, where we met Bishop Godet. Here's a nice little review of where we've been. Bartholomew goes to Chartres, that's where Bishop Godet de Marais was. He's there by December. Now look at the travel times. By the 19th, he got to Moulon in the Bourbon country to the south, and then traveling by horseback as winter was settling in, he fell from his horse on the route to Mende all the way, and remember how those steep hills up and down going to Mende. He was dragged and frightened, but he wasn't injured. Then he stayed there over Christmas. He was at Les Vins on the 31st, where the brothers had been attacked by the Camisards. You saw the picture of the house there yesterday. From there he went to Arles, where he waited out a storm until January 7th. Then he was in Avignon by the 10th. Then he went from Marseille, and from there to Grenoble, where the brothers signed the formula on January 26th. Then he headed back north. He was in Dijon by February 8th, then Troyes, and en route to Rethel, that's where he met the highwayman. Blanc, of course, has him. He scared the burglars more than they scared him. From Rethel, then he went to Reims, where the brothers signed the declaration, and then to Laon. Then he went back to St. Yan by way of Guise, Calais, and Boulogne. He got home, St. Yan time for Easter. Then he went down to Paris, all right, and filled in the Paris brothers at Versailles, Paris, and St. Denis. So by May 1717, the tour was complete, the register closed with the signatures of 99 brothers. Then, since I've been involved in general chapters, I'm always interested in this first one. So, and we have there who the delegates were. There were 16 of them altogether, all of them directors of the various houses. The oldest was Brother Doside, who was 46, the director at Rouen. The youngest was Brother Cosme, 29 years old, the director of Versailles. The directors of Moulins, Mende, Les Vins, Marseille, Dijon, and Troyes were not able to come, and all the brothers in the south were to be represented by the directors in Avignon, who would have been Timothy, Arles, and Grenoble. So that was an interesting general chapter of 16. There were about 120 in the 1966 chapter. There were about 160 in the 1976 chapter. In an attempt to broaden the representation, that proved unmanageable and much too difficult for many, many points of view. So the numbers went back again to about 120, which seems to be a working number for our general chapters. The next general chapter will be about 120. I could go on for a long time on the subject of general chapters, and particularly on the subject of representation. After having been at 3 of them, my major criticism of the structure of our general chapters is that for all practical purposes, they're meetings of the visitors, which is all right, but it certainly doesn't, this whole area, since there was so much concern in the preparation for this first general chapter to get the consent of all the brothers and all the brothers involved. Well, of course, that tradition has been preserved by asking the brothers to send notes to the general chapter. But And very honestly, not that much attention is paid to them all the time, although they're all reviewed by committees and subcommittees and so on. It's really the delegates themselves who have the impact. But there are whole groups of brothers who are not represented at the general chapter. The only reason I was able to get to them in 1966, I was the only brother in the whole chapter that was not an authority. That is, a religious authority.
Well,
It was a nice experience. I was 45 years old, running around the mother house and having all these little brothers working in the office and saying, "Oh, frère visiteur, je ne suis pas visiteur, je suis simple frère, simple brother." Oh yeah, oui, oui, frère visiteur. But it worked out very handy when you went to the cash place. You could just giving a couple of thousand, 100,000 lira or something. Oh, oui, brother, frère visiteur, signe. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I tried to do something with this in the working in the Rule Commission. It got nowhere. The mood at the moment is that every district must have at least one representative. Every sub-district with 20 brothers or more. Some sub-districts were not represented at the last time, and they raised a holy stink. And every delegation. So these delegations, some delegations are areas that once were districts and now they're on their way out. Some other delegations, like Ethiopia, are on the verge of becoming districts. Well, so that means that right away there's 80 places, huh? And then by the time you get the ex officio people, the general council and the former superior generals and so on, and 4 appointees of the superior, well, then you're already up into 94, 95, and the rule has always required somewhere between 1% and 1.5% of the members of the Institute as the number to be fixed. So 1% of the Institute now would be about 80 brothers. 1.5% would be about 120. So if you already have 95 delegates with one for every one of these little units, then that only leaves 15 extra. And and they give those to the districts with the largest number. So in 1966, New York had 3 delegates. In 1976, New York had 4. That's how I got elected, because the visitor always gets elected first. And in 1986, we had 3 again. But next year, New York may still be a bigger district, but I guess Baltimore is closer numbers now to New York. Huh? So a couple of districts in the Institute will get 2 delegates, but nobody's going to get more than 2. Now, and with this business of being elected through this system, this means that leaders, for example, Michel Sauvage was not a delegate at the last chapter. And think of the American brothers who are involved in, ever since he's out of office, Gus has not been to a chapter. People like Charlie Ruderman, Joe Schmidt, these national leaders, none of those can ever be elected to the chapters in our own country and the same in other countries and so on. And it almost inevitably excludes the young brothers. Of course, first time I was at the chapter, I thought all of the other delegates were awesome with their venerable age and all. But that when we sat according to age, and I was way in the back. The next one we sat according to the alphabet. So Gus and I were up in the front because New York has A, B, and C in the old religious thing. The next one we sat according to secular family names, so I was had all in the back again. Yes. But the first time I thought all these delegates were so venerable and old looking and everything else and kind of awesome. In the 76th chapter they looked like contemporaries. And in the 86th chapter, they look to be like a bunch of young kids. But I have heard, in some of these chapter discussions, you get brothers from certain countries. And, well, I don't suppose I should name the countries, but somebody would say, well, what is the opinion of the young brothers? And they say, oh, we know perfectly well how our young brothers feel about this, and so on and so forth. And I had good friends among the young brothers in some of those countries, and these men didn't have a clue as to what the young brothers were thinking. So that's another. So there are whole types that ought to be at general chapter. But are not. Some people argue, well, the visitor is elected by the brothers in the first place, so if he's elected to the chapter. But my theory on that is that the visitor is elected because he has the qualities to be a visitor, which doesn't necessarily mean that he has the qualities to be an effective capitulant at the chapter. My experience has been that at least half of the visitors at the chapter might just as well not be there for all that they contribute. So that's a little bit of a rebellious thought for the younger ones of you to think about, to see if you could bring about a change someday. But it's interesting that the founder wanted to get all of this. Don't get me talking about chapters and we'll never get through anything else. So we have the election of Bartholomew. It's kind of taken for granted. It doesn't take very long. The founder stays out of the picture. Bartholomew was presiding already, and so he was a shoo-in. There was no question about that. Now, and apparently one of the things they wanted to do was to get the rule into some kind of final shape. So the chapter discussed the rule and parts of the rule that they wanted to have changed. And then they entrusted it to the founder. They gave him the results of all those discussions, and it was up to him to make some revisions of the rule. Now, Blanc has a long section, 11 pages, on the recreation thing, and we've been talking about that. And another 4 or 5 pages on the rule of the brother director, which and the reluctance of the directors to have their rule read in the community. So those are some interesting things. I have another point about the rule to make, which Bland does not stress at all. He passes over very quickly, and I think it's an extremely important point that I'll make. But, okay, Gabe, what do you want to say about recreation?
No, I was just wondering if the whole area of recreation and the directors, was that kind of a sign that Bland was doing a favor or a service for Timothy surreptitiously by making such a fuss? I had almost an intuitive feeling that probably at this time, one of the most obvious areas of, not laxity, but of change might have been in that area of recreation. And Timothy was asking Blanc to emphasize this almost out of proportion to what other things were. Just an intuition.
Yeah, it's possible. It's almost as if Blanc had done a little research himself and had written a term paper on recreation that he decided to incorporate into the biography, isn't it? And all that discussion, apparently it was quite a thing among religious congregations at that time, because in some places they were actually playing games, and they were developing a spirit of fun. And in other places, like the Trappists, they weren't having any recreation at all. And the founder had this practice of having it, but having it very restricted. It's funny as hell, isn't it, to read all the sins that are committed during recreation. That Bland lists them one after the other. Bing, 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 bing. Gus?
Now, I think throughout the whole biography, Wayne is lecturing the brothers.
Yeah.
That goes throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
That's why he has all this pious company. And as superior, as ecclesiastical superior.
Yeah. And not only of the brothers, but of other orders. You know, you mentioned yesterday that you had never read the biography of Louis de Grignon de Montfort. Neither have I. But we must do it sometime, to see whether he has all the same stuff in that one that he has in this one, or the things he wrote for the sisters. That's an area of a project that some of us ought to get at. And of course, all of the sins committed in recreation are due to what we were talking about last night, namely a spirit of fun, merrymaking, and all that sort of stuff. You see. So when we say that this notion of humor, get another jab in here, that this whole business of De La Salle's sense of humor as distinct from our sense of fun and so on and so forth, well, of course it's a cultural thing, but I think it was a subcultural thing, might be more accurate. That is, in these very serious, high seriousness that we sometimes speak of, that prevailed in the Victorian era also, that the high seriousness in these religious orders and so on didn't permit any of this frivolity. But I suspect there might have been a lot of it around in the culture outside these, especially these orders that were looking towards implementing the reforms of the Council of Trent. There probably was a hell of a lot of gaiety among the old Franciscan monks, the old Benedictine monks, and so on and so forth. And so. But it was these new orders that were instruments of the Tridentine reform that got so bloody serious about all this stuff, and especially right plunk among the most serious of them all were these Sulpicians. And the pervasive influence of this Sulpician spirituality is so evident in Blanc and in the founder and in their approach to merriment and joy. And merriment, joy, and humor are not all the same thing, although it occurred to me, I didn't want to intrude last evening, but in that definition, that very intellectual definition from Father Arbuckle that Gus gave of humor, there is a common element between that definition of humor and what we're talking about in terms of our sense of fun. And the common element is a sense of incongruity. Incongruity is in both of them. You know, if a bishop farts in church, that's hilarious, huh? Or a pompous person slips on a banana peel, or something else along that's what makes people laugh. And there's also the element of surprise, and that's, I suppose, that's why you need timing to tell it. If you're going to tell a joke, you have to build up the unexpected. Like we have a brother who stutters, and he'd get very serious face on, and he'd talk about a friend of his, and he said, he's not doing well. He says he's got a case of terminal dandruff. So, anything else about that recreation or the director's thing? Yes, Floyd.
I'm not an expert on this, I don't intend to be asking the question. I think there is a difference between the way the Italian, you mentioned the Franciscans and all that, Italian and French, the difference between their view of life and levity. I think there is a difference there. I don't know what it is, but
yeah, well, I would certainly, I think we've all experienced that, and the Latin spirit is different too. The Germans aren't very good at humor either. My father we used to drive my father crazy because all of us, we all grew up in an area of hilarity in the family. But my German father and my Irish mother, of course, was often in the middle of it. But my German father could never see why we were always laughing. It's so serious, he'd say. The more he'd try to get serious, the more we'd laugh. And he always tried to suppress it. Sometimes all of the old aunts and uncles we always forbade our nieces and nephews to call us aunt or uncle. I've never been called uncle by any of my nieces, any of the 22 nieces and nephews in my whole life, because all of the same names. We had Uncle John and Aunt Mary and Aunt Katie and Aunt Alice and so on. And these family affairs, they'd come, and most of them were serious as judges, and they'd sit there and funny looks on their faces, serious, all this sort of stuff. And we were little kids, and we were not supposed to be in evidence, although there were 8 of us. So it was hard to conceal us, but so we'd be around there in the fringes. And so what we do is we give them all numbers, and we'd say, look at number 2. And so we'd all come to there'd be Aunt Sally, you know. And we'd all be in hysterics. We'd be laughing like crazy. And so then my father said, what are you kids laughing at? There's nothing funny. We're having a serious discussion here. What is this? In 1954, Maurice Hermans, who was then the subdirector of the Second Novitiate, and already after 7 years after Gus and Charlie Henry made the Second Novitiate, and going through that thing year after year after year, trying to jam the rule down these brothers' throats from all over the world, and this 1947 rule, which was the same as the 1918 rule, going through all of that and so on, Maurice Hermans began to think this thing through in terms of giving rule conferences of the second division. And he wrote a landmark essay. It's about 80 pages long, and the brothers in France had a kind of a little publication of their own called Entre Nous. And he published that article in 1954, and that really was the beginning of our present rule. And in commenting on the founder's rule, this thing is a comparison between the founder's rule of 1705, which we have a manuscript from 1705, and the rule of 1718. Now, Bland makes a big thing about the fact that the founder added the chapter on modesty, which he took from the Jesuits. But in this very, very fully developed essay, the two major additions that the founder introduced in the rule of 1718, as we call it, because the manuscript copy we have comes from one of the ones Bartholomew sent to Troyes. So we call it the rule of 1718. In that, the founder made two very significant additions. One was an introductory article at the beginning of the chapter 2 on the spirit of the Institute. And that's the famous statement which has been reproduced in the present version of the rule, where the founder says the most important thing in every institute is the spirit. And those people who don't have it are to be considered as dead members, and so on and so forth. And that this is the main thing that the novices should be trained to acquire, and this is the principal thing that if anybody has lost it, they should get it back again, and that this is something that the brothers should work out all their life. Now, Hermann's interpretation of that is that after all of these years of experience, here he is a year away from his death, with all of that insistence on every little detail and so on and so forth, that the founder really began to see that if this thing didn't have the spirit, the spirit of religiousness behind it, operating in it and so on, that all the rest of it didn't make any sense at all. So the rest of the chapter on the spirit of faith and zeal was already there. But this introductory paragraph saying that in modern language, you would almost say this gives us a hermeneutical principle by which to read the rest of the rule. And then Maurice also makes the point that right from the very beginning, there were hierarchical things in the rule. That is, some rules were more important than others. Some were considered practices. Some were revised by subsequent general chapters and so on. But that the whole way to read and to think of observing, even the old rule, the 1947 rule I was talking about, which is effectively the 1718 rule, was that the spirit behind the thing was the most important thing. And then the other addition he made is that introduction in chapter 16 on the fact that the two principal commandments are the love of God and the love of neighbor. And without these two things, without the love of God and without the love of neighbor, then all other observance is useless for salvation. So those two additions to the 1718 rule, ever since that essay was published, that has had a tremendous influence on everything else that has happened in the Institute with regard to the rule. And so it was that led the general chapter of 1956 to recognize that the attempt to produce a rule that everybody would observe in 1947 was a total failure, and that it was necessary to start from scratch. So between 56 and 66, they did that. They came up with a rule. They thought it was beautiful. We talked about this before. They gave it to a Jesuit who said, no, that's not the spirit of Vatican II. Start all over again. So they started again. And out of that came the 67 rule, and the 67 rule is the basis of the 86-7 rule that we have at the present time. But the dominant thinking through that whole thing was, if we want to be faithful to the founder's rule, even though after chapter 1 of the present rule it doesn't look much like the founder's rule, we have preserved that fundamental element from 1718. Is that all? Yes.
Those who spend their lives dedicated to the study of language tell us very clearly a term like the spirit of faith is a growing entity, and it changes with the culture, it changes with history, and so on. What kind of study would it be for a person like you or something to say, at the time of the founder, clearly he meant the spirit of faith this, now, let us say in 20th century America or something, with growth and development, history, social, and so on, this true definition of the spirit of faith is this, you see. This whole growth and developmental thing of language terms. So for me, to lean heavily just on the founder and his notion of the spirit of faith, I don't think that's quite fair.
Well, what you're suggesting has already been done. Read chapter 1 of the present rule. In other words, now I've been involved in every stage of the elaboration of this rule, which we wanted to present to the brothers in 1986, which the general chapter accepted and read as a rule that fits cultures all over the world in this present time, okay? And so in that process, we don't just use the spirit of faith, but if you read chapter 1 of our rule, I often say that if we take the 1987 rule, and if we lost everything but the first chapter, we could get along with that first chapter. Everything is there. But in this process, we looked at it the way the founder said what the spirit of faith was and how to acquire it. And with very minor alterations. All of that has been preserved in chapter 1 of the present rule. In other words, that's why I say that's been done. Chapter 1 of our present rule tells us what the spirit of faith means for us today and how to acquire it and how to maintain it. And the fundamental things are there from the founder. The importance of meditative prayer, the primary importance of the presence of God. And I think that that's one thing that brothers say everywhere. That we, in our clientele, they all remember, let us remember the holy presence of God. So that, meditation on the scripture, theological study, all of those means of self-control and self-discipline. Now, so the delegates of the chapter and all the preparatory work would say that those elements that are from the founder are still valuable and valid today for us and in all of the cultures in which the Institute is implanted. Okay, Frank?
There.
Yeah. So that's, now, when it comes to the specific way of expressing religiousness and so on, a prayer service we have here might be different from a prayer service probably not in Canada, but maybe in France or some other place, and so on and so forth. But those fundamental elements we don't want to lose. That's why I like to, because we say spirit of faith so much, I like to translate that word as religiousness. You know, how do we maintain a religious spirit, personally and in community? And how does that overflow into zeal, which is all part of the same spirit? And then how do we integrate those three elements? But all of that's there. Titled brother and so. It's all in that first chapter.
Okay. Another look.
Okay? All right, anything else about the rule? Now, of course, at this point, Blanc has that interesting flashback back to the situation in 1714, where it turns out while he was down in the south and old Bartholomew was there, they wanted to have the rule approved by the cardinal. And the cardinal was up there in St. Denis for confirmation, and so the Brew was, oh, well, why don't you ask him to approve the rules? And then, of course, the Brew gets the rule together, and no doubt the rule that he wrote was one that would incorporate all of those conditions that they had put on Bartholomew, that there be an ecclesiastical superior, that there wouldn't be any novitiate, that it would be a parochial thing, etc., etc., etc. So the cardinal said, well, yeah, all right, send it, submit it. So they sent it to the Chancery office, and through the good instrumentality of this Francois Vivant, this leads me to think that there must have been a feeling in the parish, in Paris, in the Chancery office, that De La Salle had gotten a bad deal in the Perot affair, and that the cardinal had gotten a bad deal by being stuck with this thing, and with the machinations of Chez-Tardy. And so at least this one person, anyhow, was able to stop the thing right at the source and write back to De Brew in April, before De La Salle had this. Notice the dates there, that the answer comes back to De Brew while De La Salle is still in the south, and but the letter has been written saying that no, the cardinal says, leave the brothers alone and don't do anything as long as De La Salle himself isn't here present. So that's another cliffhanger in a way, huh? Because if the cardinal had given his approval there, we would have been in real serious trouble. The founder would have found himself in an impossible position when he came back with a whole new rule totally foreign to his own thinking about what the Institute ought to be. Did everybody catch the significance of that? While we're on that topic, let me make another remark about the approval of the rule eventually. We have to talk about the Bull of Approbation in the second session, but something that not everybody realizes is that all this business about ecclesiastical approval for the rule, the first time that our rule was ever approved in its totality by the Holy See was 1947. When the brothers applied for the Bull of Approbation, one of the things that they had to submit, or they didn't ask for the whole rule, they asked for a summary of the rule. So one of the brothers was commissioned to kind of draw up a summary. He drew up a summary of 18 articles, some of which were paraphrases, and not all of which were direct texts from the rule. Right? And they were incorporated, this little précis of the rule, these 18 articles, I think they're 18, were incorporated into the Bull of Approbation. Right? Now, from that time on, after the bull, we had the bull, those, any change in those things had to be submitted, a request had to be submitted to the Holy See to have them changed. But the rest of the rule, the rest of the text of the rule had no ecclesiastical approval at all. In the chapter of 1946, when Athanase Emile was the superior general, the big tough Alsatian, there's a story about Athanase Emile when he was elected the superior general. At the election, the president of the assembly, usually the previous superior general, comes down and asks the candidate who's gotten the majority of votes if he accepts the election. And he says, I accept. So Athanase, they approached Athanase, and he not only said, I accept, but he got very dramatic. He said, I accept. He said, I adore in all things the will of God in my regard. And he knelt down, kissed the floor. But the brother sitting next to him was supposed to have heard him say as he went down to kiss the floor, enfin! At last! His opening words in his first conference was, J'entends gouverner. I intend to govern. And he did. So he was determined that his great achievement as the superior general was to get the rule approved by the church. This was the pontificate of Pius XII. The church had everything had to come from this infallible source. Without really even asking the chapter, Michel Sauvage has a lengthy description of this whole process. He submits the thing to the congregation for total approval. And so the whole rule was approved, which meant that henceforth that we couldn't do anything with it ourselves, couldn't change the slightest article without getting clearance from the Holy See. Now, of course, that might have meant we'd have been stuck with that thing forever, but then we decided, and this was one of the major problems between 56 and 66, whether or not this new rule we were working on could get through the Vatican thing. But then Vatican II came along, and then all the orders were told to revise their rules, so then that opened the door for a new one. But then when John Paul II came and the new Code of Canon Law, your constitutions have to all be approved by the Vatican, and the big problem that we had between the chapter, the general chapter, and the approval of the rule was that the Vatican took all of the things out of the Constitution, out of the rules, the statutes as we call them, and put most of them into the Constitution. So we're almost back where Athanase had it, but not quite so bad. Okay. So those are some things I think that are not totally irrelevant with regard to the business of the rule. and the chapters and so on. This is something that continues in the Institute. Any question about it, Andy?
The rule of government, you mentioned that on one occasion, Gabe Costello would always mention that chapter. Does that fit in around this time, or?
No, well, now, Blah has this long section on the rule of the brother director, which was independent of the common rules, right? And it was written for the directors, and the directors didn't want anybody else to read it, or much less have it read in community, because that would challenge them. In addition to that, at the same time, there was a section on the nourishment of the brothers and the habit of the brother, all right? And so that had an existence independent of the common rules. And that was the sort of the nucleus out of which the Book of Government grew and grew and grew like Topsy over all the course of all the years. That's where the stuff on smoking went. Did I tell you that story before about I was the guardian for one of the brothers?
No.
I have all these stories and stuff. Trying to talk about Mochi Kabuma.
Best part.
When I was in the novitiate, a brother I was from Albany, and an older man came from Albany. Well, we didn't know at the time he was an incurable alcoholic, but anyway, the brothers from Albany felt maybe he showed an interest in the brothers, and he came. And I was appointed his guardian angel in the novitiate. So it was the winter time, and we were walking around in circles there, and of course the first thing he gets in his hands is the rule. So he's walking around behind me, reading the rule. Like fury. And he slams the thing shut about halfway through the spiritual reading period. And he says, "Hey," he says, "there's nothing in here about smoking." He devoured the whole thing trying to find where the smoking was forbidden because he had been told it. So I said, "It's in the Book of Government." "What's that?" I said, "I can't tell you. Ask the director. You're breaking silence." So so the first, there's a whole history to the publication of the Book of Government. The first thing called the Book of Government came just before the French Revolution, I believe. And then that kept growing and growing and growing, all right? So in the 67 chapter, we not only had to revise the rule and the constitutions, but the Book of Government was done separately and independently of the rule. The problem in 86 was that we had to incorporate everything in the Book of Government into the rule. That was one of the big problems in 86, to take what had been the rule and the constitutions from 60 and the Book of Government and get all of that had to be incorporated into the one text and shortened, okay? But Gabe Costello was on the commission that put that together, which had a kind of a different mentality from the group that did the declaration of the rule. That's why he and I used to, Gus and I sometimes disagree. You should hear when Gabe Costello and I get at one another. The brothers almost went to Canada in the founder's lifetime. And when De La Salle heard about it, at first he seemed to be going along with it, and then we had second thoughts. He said to Bartholomew, "You must be out of your mind! You know, what do you think you're doing?" Of course, when the brothers first came to the United States in 1817, they came and the similar thing happened. The bishop here got hold of them, scattered them in 3 different places, and nothing ever came of that foundation. The founder is here in the parish of Nicholas of Chardonnay from October to March. Bartholomew sends him down there to finish out the negotiations to get the Rogier legacy. The founder won't sign the thing as long as the word superior is there. So finally the lawyer says, well, in this we can make an exception in this case and let him sign without the word superior in front of that. And so it's interesting here again. It looks as if the founder really wants to get out of the way. I think he would have preferred, if he had his brothers, to stay there and die in Nicholas of Chardonnay and just prepare for death there. Very interesting descriptions of him. I like the one that that the superior sent. Maybe we can take a look at that for a minute. It comes towards the end there on page 210. But it gives you, it's one of the few glimpses we get of the founder actually acting as a priest someplace. In the middle paragraph, He made at least 3 hours of meditation regularly every day. He was more faithful to the house regulations than the lowliest of seminarians, obeying with admirable promptness the first sound of the bell which announced the exercises. He was so submissive that he wearied the prefect by coming to ask him for permissions, even for those which are not required of the seminarian, as, for example, to speak with persons who came asking to see him, to bring him to his room, as you yourself noticed more than once. He's writing this to Bartholomew. To go out on free days, and even to write letters, for he never wrote a single one without an express permission. The interesting of some of those letters were to be ever found, the ones that he wrote from there. He was so willing to accede to the requests made to him to take part in funeral processions without a stipend. See, they were demanding priests for this stipend. Or to conduct the funerals of children. None of them wanted to do that because there's no money in it. So it seemed as if that was something he valued very much. In the word retirement, prayer, charity, humility, mortification. So he spent a good part of his time there presiding at funerals that nobody else would take. Very interesting little insight. Okay, so then we have finally, Bartholomew, he practically has to be ordered, again almost by virtue of the vow, to come back to St. Jan. He does. He resumes the taking of the novices. Bland gives a little hint here, doesn't he, that while the founder was away, things were falling apart in the novitiate there. Of course, that letter that Gus quoted last night indicates somewhat the same thing, that as soon as the founder was away, the mice would play or something, apparently. So at any rate, that's part of the thing. And then we have the long account of his gradual illness, one thing after another. That terrible struggle, again, the same old thing. The parish priest wanted all of those. The contract was that they should bring their boarders and everybody to the parish church for Mass on Sunday. And De La Salle finally decided that it didn't make any sense to bring the delinquents there. But the pastor wanted, and so he said Mass for them in St. Jan, and the parish priest was up in arms over this. Went to the chancery office again, and the vicar general sided with the pastor of St. Sever. And this back and forth relationship with the pastor again, and the diocese. And Daubigny never liked the brothers from the time he had been vicar general in Chartres under Godet, de Moraga. And so Daubigny was not particularly happy about this whole thing. And so he gets called a liar. Bland tries to defend him because Bland is in the middle of the chancery crowd too, and any of these discussions he would have been present for as the ecclesiastical superior of the brothers. And he was unable to use his influence to defend the founder, and so finally they decided to suspend him from his faculties as a priest. And Bland hasn't got the heart to tell him, but he hints at it pretty broadly. And so when finally somebody comes to give De La Salle the news, he says, well, I wasn't too surprised. He said, I guessed right from the beginning what was going to happen. And so he dies only a few days later. And the account of his reception of Viaticum first on Wednesday of Holy Week, and then extreme unction on Thursday. Notice the emphasis that you practically have to be dead before they would administer these last sacraments. And then finally his death and his last testament and his last words. Gus, can you give us the French of the last words exactly?
De Dieu, amour de God.
There's no
Thank God, I think. Now, that's usually translated, I adore in all things the will of God in my regard. Gus alerted me to this too, for which I'm very grateful, one of the things I learned. Although again, we had to disagree somehow on how to retranslate it. Because this brother, we got involved in talking about the conduct of schools, the management of schools. And so Brother Lenny Marsh of the Line District, who's this expert in 17th century French, wrote for us a couple of years ago a marvelous 3 or 4 page analysis of what the word conduite meant. And it has that all those overtones that we're using today of the word accompaniment of guiding, of leading, etc. It's not just conduct, huh? And so he doesn't say, I adore, it's not the will of God, but it's the guidance of God. In tout choses, in every aspect of my life. Gus typically likes to translate this in all the details of my life. Huh? I don't know whether you still do or not. You can defend yourself in a minute. But and of course, the thing that he's adoring is God. So it's God guiding him. He's adoring the guidance that God has given him. And again, this fits in with that notion that we have of a journeying, of a progression all along. That he had all of this, looking back over his whole life. And so he can say, I adore what God has been doing with me all the time. Huh? It isn't just isolated things of God's will and I follow God's will. But I adore it every aspect, and tout choses, in every aspect of it. God guiding me. Right? So we have to get a new translation circulating here a little bit. What I like to use was, I adore God guiding me in every aspect of my life, or something like that. And of course, one could say that at any time. I thought it was appropriate to use for the Jubilee. What do you think about that?
Actually, my translation was very similar to yours. I adore God guiding me in every detail of my life. If you change that to your call Jubilee, I adore God guiding me in all the happenings of my life. In all the happenings.
I think of a happening every happening in my life or something like that. But anyway.
The action of God in my regard.
The action of God in my regard is better than the will, huh? But I think...
It was curious. I found a 30-day retreat holy cards going back to like 1906. And lo and behold, the translation was, I adore the guidance of God.
Yeah, which isn't bad, huh? So he's dead. He's buried he's waked between Good Friday and Holy Saturday afternoon. He's buried in the parish church, the spot where he was buried, and that the cover of his tomb you can still visit there. There was the parish church right next to the property of St. Jan. It wasn't until some years later that the brothers built that famous chapel at St. Jan. We saw pictures of it yesterday. Where he was transferred. Okay, is there anything anybody wants to pick up about that?
This would have been, he was buried in his priestly vestments. Would that have had to be a decision by the will that the will have been taken for granted?
Oh no, I think it was taken for granted. Priests are always, it might even be prescribed in the rubrics for the funeral that the priest is always dressed as for Mass, in a chasuble. And you know, the whole business, the alb, chasuble, stole, all the rest of it. And most of the time when they're laid out, they often, instead of crucifixes and rosary beads and things like that, they very often have the priest's chalice in his hands when he's laid out. And if they're bishops, of course, they have their mitres on.
He was buried as a priest and not as a brother.
Oh yeah, well, you notice there's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you have to pick up these little things in Bland, the best stuff. That's one reason why you have to read them kind of carefully. Is at one point when he comes back to St. Jan, he said, if you would have thought he was a serving brother, huh? If it were not for his tonsure and his soutane. Huh? So he always, I don't think he habitually wore the habit of a brother. He did, I think, especially in those early years when he went off to teach, if they were going to be laughed at and throw mud at them, he was willing to endure that too. But I think when he traveled around, when he went to visit the Archbishop and so on, he would have been wearing a clerical soutane.
On the same fact, presumably he would have to renew his tonsure all the time.
Yeah, well, now whether he did that or not is hard. I'm inclined to doubt it, because even very shortly after his ordination, when he became canon of the week, one of the things that was prescribed was that the tonsure be renewed. Although some of the presumption is that it hadn't been kept up. But whether he did or not, and from the pictures we have of him, of course, you don't have anything from the back of his head, so that's hard to say.
Today, do we not say, I adore in all things the holy, holy, holy will of God in my regard? And how did that slip into it? Or is that, like, I think in morning prayer this morning.
I know, it's just somebody's mistranslation.
Is it?
Yeah, that's a mistranslation, that's what I'm saying. That's the French. Somebody translate conduit as will. Chris?
I was going to ask, is the Marsh paper on the meaning of conduit, is that published somewhere?
Gus, do you know where, I have a copy of it, Marsh's thing on conduit, where is it?
Oh, I don't think it's been published. I think he just circulated it among few brothers.
Who asked them to do that?
I did.
You did, yeah.
He took it as a kind of a paper submitted at a course that he took at Harvard University one summer. I talked to him frequently about how to translate words, and that was one word. Actually, there is a dictionary called Robert's French Dictionary, which not only gives the meaning of the word today, but it gives a history of the meaning of the word, going back to like the 14th and 15th century, whenever French began to be formed. And it was, through such scholarship, that he worked on that book. He says that the word conduire was a very significant word in French culture during Lasallian time. And that word figures in the memoir on the origin, that the events were conducting me and God was conducting me. So that, that's why Michel Campo says that Lasalle saw God in events, which is a very contemporary kind of spirituality.
At 11 o'clock, we'll do the Bull of Approbation, the letters patenta, and then we'll call it.